This is the LatinNews podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. This week's very special guest is William LeoGrande. He's the professor of government and a specialist in Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, and also the author of Back Channel to Cuba, the hidden history of negotiations between Washington and Havana. So welcome on the LatinNews podcast, William.
My pleasure to be with you today.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure for us, and no guesses to anyone out there what we're going to be discussing today. But it's Cuba that is up on our list of important topics. And of course, well, thinking about early January 2025, President Trump taking the presidential office. And, well, of course, Cuba, how does Cuba fit into all of this? And, of course, Marco Rubio as well, child of Cuban immigrants. And, well, I can guess we can expect more hawkish attitudes towards Cuba from Washington, D.C.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Senator Rubio was the main Republican critic of President Obama 10 years ago when Obama announced that he intended to normalize relations with Cuba. In fact, Rubio almost built his presidential campaign around that attack on Obama. And when President Trump came in the first time, Rubio bragged that he and Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, another Republican of Cuban-American origin, had written Trump's Cuba policy for him. And of course, that was a policy of maximum pressure to try to really squeeze the Cuban economy. So I expect that we'll be moving back towards that kind of a policy again.
I have to ask, though, how much more can the U.S. squeeze Cuba? Is there anything left to squeeze? We're looking at, issues of a lack of drinking water there, power outages, an energy crisis, the contraction of the economy. What possibly more can the U.S. do?
Well, unfortunately, there's actually quite a lot more they could do. So President Biden relaxed a few of Trump's sanctions. He made it a little easier for people in the United States to travel to Cuba. He took all the restrictions off remittances that people can send to particularly family members in Cuba. And he provided some assistance to small businesses on the island. Well, all of those things could be reversed by the Trump administration. And the issue of remittances is particularly important because that was, before COVID, one of the main sources of hard currency or foreign exchange currency earnings for Cuba. It's gone down since then, but it's still a really important supplement for the standard of living of the Cubans who are getting help from their families in the United States. It would be possible for the Trump administration to simply cut off remittances entirely. Now, Cuban Americans would find some way to get remittances to their family members, but the amounts would be drastically reduced. And that would make life even harder for, the ordinary Cuban in the street. The other thing that they could do is they could create what are called secondary sanctions, where the United States imposes sanctions on foreign companies or foreign individuals for having business with Cuba. Even though the United States is not a party to that transaction at all, it is possible to do that. And for example, take Spanish hotels that are Spanish hotel companies that run hotels in Cuba. The United States could conceivably impose secondary sanctions on those companies, barring them from access to the U.S. financial system or to U.S. markets. That would create an enormous deterrent for any foreign company to do any kind of business with Cuba.
That sounds quite terrifying, the possibility of doing that. Of course, I imagine there's a sort of similar way that the US is dealing with Venezuela on that one, a little bit barring companies from doing work with them and the banking system and so on. But I see that the Cubans or the Cuban regime is kind of looking forwards to this inclusion as a partner in the BRICS as being some sort of success story, but I fear it's not going to be too much. Considering these secondary sanctions and considering everything else that's likely to happen to Cuba, and I guess we can suppose that the Trump administration is going to be stronger, more on Cuba. How much can Cuba rely on becoming or its inclusion as a partner in the BRICS?
Well, it's helpful, of course, for Cuba to be able to diversify its international economic relations. It's got fairly good relations with a number of those countries already. I don't think that that's going to be a panacea for them, though. None of those countries are going to be able to provide the kind of external resources, first of all, to cushion additional U.S. sanctions, or to really provide the Cuban economy with the external capital flows that it needs to really begin the process of recovery.
So if we look at your book was written, the book was written 10 years ago, almost to the month. This the history of negotiations between Washington and Havana, the back channel to Cuba. It's the 10-year anniversary of Obama kind of lifting or working towards a normalization. Would you ever have predicted what is going on now as 10 years ago?
No, 10 years ago, Cuba was very hopeful. I happened to be in Havana when President Castro and President Obama made the announcement that they intended to normalize relations. And people were jubilant. People were demonstrating in the streets. Church bells were ringing. Everyone was talking about it. Because for Cubans, it was as if a war had ended. And in a sense, it had. The United States had been waging economic war against Cuba for half a century. And for most Cubans, it meant hope for the future, that the economy would really start to grow, the embargo would be lifted. And so it was a joyous moment, really. And that enthusiasm lasted for the next 2 years. As the two countries began to draw closer to, and then we had Donald Trump, which really dashed those hopes when he repudiated normalization and reimposed a lot of the sanctions and more sanctions than Obama had on Cuba. So things have really gone downhill from there. The surprising thing was President Biden not returning to Obama's policy of engagement. After all, he was Obama's vice president. During the campaign of 2020, he pledged that he would return to Obama's policy for the most part. And then he came to office and he didn't. As I said earlier, he lifted a few sanctions, but he left the large part of Trump's sanctions in place at a time when Cuba was really struggling under COVID. The tourism industry is the centerpiece of the Cuban domestic economy. And of course, COVID closed it down entirely for almost 2.5 years. So Cuba was really, really struggling. And the sanctions that Trump had put on were crippling the economy. And Biden did almost nothing to alleviate that.
What can we attribute this to? Was it just easier to continue along this line, or was he very aware of the opposition voices in Florida? Or was it heavy lobbying in Washington?
I think it was some of each. On the one hand, of course, Cuba was not a high priority given all the other things that President Biden had to deal with coming to office. So they did nothing at all, really, for the first 6 months or so. Then you had surprising demonstrations in Cuba in July of 2021, really nationwide demonstrations, the first time that had happened since 1959. And the police reacted very harshly. Hundreds of people were arrested. Hundreds were sentenced to prison, relatively long prison terms. And so the Biden administration reacted against that, understandably, on human rights grounds. And then it became, I think, politically harder for them to do anything positive in the wake of those demonstrations. Also, President Biden formulated his foreign policy right from the beginning around this idea of the confrontation globally between democracy and authoritarianism. And of course, the authoritarians he was focused on, Russia and China, two of Cuba's closest allies. And Cuba, after all, is not a democracy. So I think Cuba got slotted into the authoritarian adversary box by this overall Cold War framework that Biden adopted. But the domestic political issues were important as well. Biden's first chief of staff, Ron Klain, was in charge of Al Gore's recount in 2000 when Al Gore lost Florida and the presidency by just 537 votes because Bill Clinton sent 6-year-old Elian Gonzalez back to his father in Cuba, enraging the Cuban American community. So Gore got very, very few Cuban American votes in 2000, and that's why he lost the election. So Ron Klain has never gotten over that, and he admits that he's never gotten over that. And for him, Florida is still the third rail of American politics. And then, of course, you had Senator Bob Menendez, who was a friend of President Biden. And Biden's own decision-making style on tough issues was to check in with his Senate colleagues, his former Senate colleagues, who were specialists on the issue. And so on Cuba, that was Bob Menendez. And Menendez was absolutely opposed to any kind of opening to Cuba. So I think you put all those things together, and the result is a president who just wasn't willing to do anything more than just the minimal that he had to do to resist pressures from Latin America to go back to Obama's policy.
You mentioned the jubilation and the people celebrating in the streets as if a war was over, and now we have Miguel, the President Miguel Diaz Canel, saying that Cuba is on wartime economy. What does this mean?
It means austerity, essentially. Okay. The government is cutting back on, everything, because they just don't have the resources. They are short of food because they import 80% of their food, and they just don't have the resources to pay for the food they need. Same with medicine, same with fuel. And now they're suffering periodic blackouts of electricity because they don't have the fuel or the spare parts to keep their thermoelectric plants running.
Before we move on to that and the energy, could we also suggest that this wartime economy could also justify greater repression and total control?
Well, there's no question the government has become much less tolerant of any effort to organize opposition. Right after the demonstrations in July of 2021, which took the government by surprise, it began to really crack down on any kind of organized opposition. And the result is that a lot of leaders of organized opposition groups have just gone into exile because the government makes it much easier for them to go into exile than to continue to be dissidents. And the few that have refused to leave are in jail. So the result is that there's very little organized opposition left, but you still see these spontaneous outbursts of protest, when the lights have been out for 2 or 3 days in a particular community, or there's no water in a community for days at a time.
And that's what we're seeing that's being reported in the press very frequently right now. And it seems a pretty desperate situation when you have an economy, a country entirely reliant, with 95% reliant on fossil fuels, accounting for the island's energy or electricity generation, and upwards from 48% of this being imported fossil fuels. It seems like Cuba relies on the imports it can't afford and on trading partners that are supplying a diminishing amount. There doesn't seem to be any solution forthcoming.
No, there's no easy short-term solution for them. Most countries in this situation could appeal to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank for bridge funding to get them out of the immediate crisis and begin to sort of rebuild the economy. But the Cubans are not members of the IMF or the World Bank, and the United States would oppose their membership even if they were interested. So that's just not a solution for them. The result is that they've looked to foreign allies like Russia, China, Venezuela for support just to basically keep the lights on and import the food that they need. It's a very desperate situation. There are some economic reforms that they've made and additional ones they could make that would help them in the medium to long term. But in the short term, they're just in an extremely difficult situation, and there's really not much prospect that things will get better in the immediate future.
So this is all incredibly negative for the island. And what remains of the achievements of the revolution, let's say, health, education, and social equality, if anything?
So all of those achievements, which sort of the crown jewels of the revolution, have all taken a hit as a result of this. It's still the case that the government is trying to provide a basic diet for everyone. It's a thinner diet than it was 10 years ago, but there is still a basic diet of highly subsidized food that people are able to buy. Right. There is still free healthcare, although there aren't very many medicines available. There is still free universal education, although a lot of teachers have been leaving the country. So you can see a pretty clear deterioration in a lot of the things that Cuba was most proud of. There's also rising inequality, and that's because the people who have, well, there's really a couple of groups, subgroups, if you will, of people in Cuba who do have money. One is people who get remittances from abroad because the value of foreign exchange currency is very high right now. Another is people who work in the private sector. The Cuban private sector has been growing recently, and people who are working in the private sector are either paid higher wages or paid some of their wages in foreign exchange currency. And so they're doing okay. And then there are people who are able to work abroad, artists, musicians, to some extent writers, who are able to sell or publish their work abroad and make money from that. And so they have an income, at least part of an income, in hard currency. Those groups of people are doing okay, but they're a minority of the population overall.
And you mentioned like teachers and others going into exile. I have a statistic here that since 2022, upwards of 850,000 Cubans have arrived in the US. This number is only going to increase, I suppose, despite all of the work that the incoming administration promises to do about shutting the borders and so on. This is a huge amount of people, and somewhere around, I guess, 10% of the population have left.
Yeah, that's right. Probably closer to 1 million have come to the United States if you count the people who've come legally, as well as those who have just showed up on the southern border of the United States. And there are several 100,000 more that have been going to other countries in Latin America, or many of them going to Spain. And it's been a disproportionately young and highly educated group that's been going. And so that's a particular drain on the Cuban economy. It makes it even harder for the economy to really get started once again. The growth of the private sector is the one area where there has been some hope. A lot of the entrepreneurs who have opened new businesses tend to be younger people, tend to be well-educated people, and they're sticking it out because they think that, there's a future for them in the country. Mm-hmm. One of the real tragedies potentially of intensified U.S. sanctions is that it will drive those people out of business. And then you'll see many of them leaving as well.
So sanctions, I mean, we can point at them as, of course, affecting the population, affecting the general Cuban, but possibly if we look away from the sanctions and say one of the fundamental causes is that just for the failure of the island is that Cuba does not generate enough exports to pay for its imports at all. I think sanctions are one thing, but we're not going to see the regime fall unless there's change within the structure. It's not going to come externally. But what do you think on this?
Well, there's no question that the Cuban economy right now is in a deep depression. Production last year, pretty much across the board, fell drastically. And part of the reason for that is because they don't have the money to import the inputs that they need for domestic production. And as domestic production falls, exports fall. So they're earning even less hard currency. So they even have even less import capacity. And they're in a kind of a vicious downward circle right now. The Cuban economy is also sort of in the middle of a reform process that Raul Castro started in 2011. His goal was to emulate a kind of Vietnamese model of market socialism. Cuba had inherited a system of central planning from the Soviet Union that had a lot of the same problems that the old Vietnamese system had. And they looked to Vietnam as a model of where to get to. The problem is, of course, Vietnam is a very different country. And while they had a lot of this, Cuba has a lot of the same problems Vietnam had, they don't have the same path out of those problems. Right? Vietnam was 80 or 90% rural. They had cheap rural labor that they could rely on. They had oil, and they finally reached reconciliation with the United States.
I mean, Cuba was looking to model themselves on a Vietnamese way of you said, of market socialism, but it's not at all. I mean, they're two very different places. With, again, it isn't working.
Well, it's not that they've tried the same policies as Vietnam. As I say, they wanted to get to the same place of a kind of a combination of socialism, but with a lot of market mechanisms, private enterprise, and so on. And this process of reform went very slowly because there were vested interests in the bureaucracy, the government and the party bureaucracy that resisted it. Then they got hit with COVID, right, which put everything on just an emergency survival basis. And now we've got U.S. sanctions intensified once again. So they sort of got stuck in the middle of this process. In 2021, they put in place a currency reform, which was designed to try to get prices and exchange rates right. And it was badly done. And the result was to unleash severe inflation. And so people since 2021, the purchasing power, the real purchasing power of the Cuban peso has fallen by 90%. So they've just gotten into a really desperate situation. And as I say, there's no easy exit from it at this point.
And it will only worsen in the coming months. It seems to me that when we discussed in the last episode with Ambassador Shannon, U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America is really the great Caribbean region. So all of Northern South America and the Caribbean and Central America. Of course, Cuba playing a huge role in this, and with, as we said, mentioned previously, Marco Rubio. So we feel that Cuba and Mexico and then latterly Venezuela will be the top items for Latin America in Washington. With this in mind, in a perfect world, do you believe that there are areas for cooperation between the US government and Cuba? For example, I mean, for the obvious one, migration, and next, the second one for me would be drug trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Well, and those are the areas where cooperation has been the best for the last 25 years. You know, Bill Clinton's administration really forged a good relationship with Cuba in the field of counter-narcotics. And Cuba is actually the most reliable partner we have in the Caribbean when it comes to countering narcotics trafficking. And migration, we've had, again, migration agreements. Clinton administration signed 2 migration agreements with Cuba. And although the first Trump administration failed to carry those agreements out, they've worked pretty well when presidents have abided by them. We'll see now if the Trump administration, the new Trump administration, actually abides by those agreements or if it abrogates them the way it did last time.
Definitely an issue that I see raising its head. And as you say, this spiral, very difficult to get out. If Cuba, again, were to turn the page, what would have to happen between the relationship with the US in order to pull Cuba from this, this chasm it is in?
It seems pretty clear that the Trump administration is going to once again have a policy based on the objective of regime change. That is to say, to collapse the Cuban government. Now, that, as a matter of fact, would be a disaster for the interests of the United States. A regime collapse in Cuba is not going to look like, Czechoslovakia in 1989, where, you have a peaceful people's power transition, because there isn't any organized opposition in Cuba capable of stepping in and taking over. And you've got a military and security forces that are at the center of the regime, and there's no indication of any division between the political leadership and the security forces that would generate a sudden regime transition. So if things were to simply break down in Cuba, you're more likely to get social chaos and violence, which then opens the door to migration, to, intervention by Cuban Americans on their own in an ongoing conflict there, opens the door to transnational crime, to be able to set up a depot for narcotics trafficking and human trafficking into the United States. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba was in a similar difficult economic situation, the analysis inside the United States government would be that the United States should try to avoid regime collapse because of the chaos that it would cause and the threat that it would pose to U.S. interests. But that's not how Cuban American Republicans in South Florida think. They want to see the regime collapse, and with some of them hoping they're going to go back and take over the island. So we'll have to see, but arguably increased sanctions by the Trump administration are going to aggravate the 2 problems that he seems to be most concerned about out of Latin America, which is migration and narcotics trafficking.
And as you say, those in southern Florida, the attitude is regime change, regime collapse at any cost.
Yes, and they've been trying to do it for 60 years now. And the fact that it hasn't worked hasn't deterred them.
And I mean, God, so you get the impression then that it would be another Caribbean island, probably not, hopefully it wouldn't go as far off, off kilter like Haiti, for example, but what you're describing is not dissimilar.
You can see that as a sort of the worst case outcome here. Already basic social services have been deteriorating for lack of resources. Now, it's not a failed state in the sense that Haiti is a failed state, where there is no central government that has any real authority or control over the island. The Cuban government has control over the island. It just doesn't have the resources to deliver the basic services that people expect from government.
Sure. So we're left with President Miguel Diaz-Canel making his declarations from the pulpit. He's sort of like, despite everything, there remains homeland, the revolution, and socialism, which guarantees protection for all.
Well, he's, I think, making the best of a bad situation by trying to inspire people, exhort people to just hang in there and sort of keep working hard and keep fighting. But, he needs to, I think personally, he needs to do a better job of conveying to Cubans what his government's strategy is for getting out of this mess, because they haven't really done that. Periodically, they announce, a new policy here, a new policy there, but it seems very ad hoc, very piecemeal, very reactive. There isn't a sense of, here's this, we recognize the problem, here's the strategy to get out of it, and here's what we're going to do tomorrow, the day after, and the day after that. That would at least give people some sense of hope of a solution to these problems, where right now, I don't think people have that.
No solution, and possibly we say no coherent long-term strategy at all. As you say, reactive to the energy failures, the blackouts, the lack of drinking water that so many people are suffering from. It doesn't seem like there's very much that we can point to that is good news for Cuba in the coming years, and in particular under the incoming administration. If we're sitting here in a few years' time talking once again, hopefully we can be talking about a positive change for the island. But I fear it's going to get a lot worse before anything gets better.
There really doesn't appear to be any viable solution for them in the short term. They need external assistance. They need bridge funding from someplace. Can they patch that together between their new friends in the BRICS? The Venezuelan government seems to be solidly in place, despite having lost the last election. And then Russia and China. As tensions rise between the United States and China in particular, it's possible that China will respond by increasing its support for Cuba. Heretofore, the Chinese have been reluctant to do that because they're waiting for the Cuban economic reform program to really take hold. China tends to not be operating abroad as a charity, but rather looking for return on investment. And so far, there hasn't been a lot in the Cuban case. But, for Russia, historically, assistance to Cuba was not about the economics. It was about the geopolitics.
Yes.
And as relations between the United States and China deteriorate, that could begin to be a consideration for the Chinese as well.
Which would, despite being a negative to the US, would be a definite step up for Cuba, of course. I mean, it's just the way these things play out.
Any external resources the Cubans can get at this point are positive, because they need every dollar or every yuan or every euro that they can find.
Well, listen, I think that's a place where we can end this conversation, which has been a really, really quite special and very, very informative about the troubles on the island of Cuba. It's all pretty negative right now, but let me take this moment to say thank you so much to William LeoGrande, the professor of government and specialist in Latin American politics and US foreign policy towards Latin America, author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. William, thank you so much for your time. This has been the Latin News Podcast. I've been Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. Remember to subscribe and share to the Latin News Podcast. We will be back in a fortnight's time with more episodes on issues from the region. Goodbye.